Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Acid Horizon. The past few weeks have been a whirlwind, and between preparing for the release of the Acephalus and Vintagia decks and bringing the finishing touches to the companion compendium for Acephalus, our days have been pretty full here. And as I write this, the decks are making their way here and will soon be ready for shipping. And I get messages every day asking, where can I find Acephalus? Where can I find Vintagia? Where's the link for that? And the answer is simple. If you are connected to the Acid Horizon Patreon or any of our social media, especially this Patreon account, you will be one of the first to hear about the availability of surplus that we have promised. And to put it quite plainly, if you have supported our Patreon account, and if you have been a supporter of Left Hand, or if you've supported Noah Trapolino's work, or the wider Acid Horizon project, you will have the first opportunity to get those decks. And for our listeners and community members, we will also be running a special giveaway to mark the launch. So make sure that you're connected to some of our primary social media, because we are going to have special sales and giveaways. All of this, the decks, the book, and the events that we are planning around them, is possible because of the ongoing support that you contribute to the Acid Horizon Patreon account. Now, one of the places where these projects will be front and center is the Durations Festival, November 8th and 9th at Public Records in Brooklyn. It's shaping up to be an incredible convergence of performance, sound, and thought. And just to give you a taste, 5 Gates, Disquiet of the Virtual and the Artificial, a live encounter between Jason Babak Mohageg and Reza Nagaristani, and me, actually, and a unique panel on philosophy and magic is also planned that will be hosted by Meredith Graves. At this event, I may even have some special decks to give away. And with that, let's turn to today's discussion with Dominic Pettman talking about his book, Ghosting on Disappearance. Let's listen. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. A specter is haunting the world, and yes, it may still be communism, but the digital age is also crowded with other specters, other ghosts. Ours is an era of ghosters and ghostees, a time when lives are shaped by the silent severance we now call ghosting. What does it mean to inhabit a culture where relationships can vanish overnight without explanation? How does ghosting turn what once felt real into something doubtful, as if it were only ever imaginary? And in a world already struggling to give events a proper ending, what happens when ghosting ensures that certain stories never conclude? Today, we are joined again by Dominic Pettman to discuss his new book, Ghosting on Disappearance, out now with Polity Press. In this episode, we'll trace ghosting not only through dating, but also through friendships, families, and workplaces, asking how it reshapes intimacy, accountability, and closure. Together, we hope to explore how ghosting unsettles our sense of narrative finality, how it can serve as both a self-protection and a kind of psychic violence, and how it reflects deeper patterns of absence, abandonment, and spectral presence in contemporary life. Dominic, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks so much. You're excellent to be here.
So let's begin. In your research, in your expansive research, and considering the book that you brought onto Acid Horizon in the past, what drew you to ghosting as a phenomenon worthy of philosophical or cultural analysis?
I'm actually blanking on the exact moment, but I knew when I thought of it that I was onto something. Surprisingly, there is no sort of monograph length cultural studies type analysis of ghosting that I've managed to find, which is surprising, obviously, because it's all through the discourse. You see it, there are thousands and thousands of journal articles and newspaper articles and magazine pieces on it. So I think I've always been interested in the spectral side of media, the kind of Kittler wing, we might call it. Jeffrey Sconce has this great book called Haunted Media. And so I've always been intrigued by the ghost in the machine, as it were. But I guess the idea just bubbled up more recently, and it tumbled out, actually. I felt like it had to be written quickly in order to scoop. I was sort of a little excited about maybe being the first to take on a book-length project on ghosting. And so I did feel a bit of pressure to do it quickly. And yeah, I've been happy with, I had a feeling that like food, who doesn't want to talk about food, and who doesn't want to talk about being ghosted? Because
Right.
it's such a common phenomenon now. And it is strange that we haven't, we talk about the etiquette of it a little bit, or we complain about it, but we haven't really contextualized it or thought about it in any kind of genealogical sense or theoretical sense. And so that was exciting to me to kind of just sort of use my usual theory lenses and take a look at this thing.
Well, Adam and I both got the book, and look, we're here to kind of sell the book. Polity gave us the book to take a look at, but we both loved it. We were in our group chat just going back and forth, sharing lines from the book. And I think a first place to start is, what is ghosting? Because in the book, you take the term ghosting and you expand it somewhat to almost talk about absencing as a broader kind of cultural phenomenon. And not necessarily to my surprise, but I was very happy to find within the book the origin of the term ghosting, or where we can find that term used for the first time on social media. So maybe you can take us through a genealogy of ghosting as you understand it and how you use that term in the book.
Sure. And thanks for the kind words. I'm really delighted, obviously, that you enjoyed it. I did read it to be not just a dour kind of academic study, as it were. Not that you're afraid of those on this podcast. Yeah, exactly. Bring on 800 pages of German theory, please. But in a way, it's hard to really draw that chalk outline around the definition, because the way it's been deployed historically, and it does sort of unpack into, as you say, absencing more generally. But it began in the English language, at least as death, as even murder in kind of Renaissance times, and just developed into, I think around the 80s it was being used, in 1980s, that is, in terms of just leaving the English way, as they say. But it only crept, surprisingly, I suppose, it only crept into the Oxford English Dictionary around 2012, I think, when it became the rather precise definition that we think of today, which is somebody's just suspending or stopping all contact without warning and basically icing you out completely. I'm forgetting the exact definition. People are welcome to go to the OED and look it up. But I believe that's it. And it has a very digital kind of resonance to it, because, as I argue in the book, that the digital infrastructure of the internet allows for this. Obviously, people have been leaving each other without warning, abandoning each other, absenting themselves since the dawn of time. This is not a new thing. But the very fact that we have this new, I suppose it's slang, but it's a little more official than slang, a little more formal. I guess it's internet speak, turning a noun into a verb.
And the first time it was used on the internet was on Twitter in like 2008 or something, isn't there?
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I love that part. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot that little important moment. I think that was where it was seized by the lexicographers, or the people who that's sort of in the pantheon now on Wikipedia or whatever. If you look it up, that's. I guess we all aspire to have a tweet that goes down in history like that. But yeah, that's the sort of very nutshell version of its history. But as I said, I think the tension between the very fact that this new word has these new associations, or this new kind of crystallization of feeling around it and associations, then there's nothing new under the sun, and yet there are always these mutations, these evolutions, these wrinkles in the way we interact. So I think it's a sort of both and situation there.
And what's I guess important to highlight as well is that yes, this is a term which has sort of come of age on the internet, but it's not come of age in a sense because of the internet, but because of the social conditions in which we have to be so terminally online. I mean, listeners, I mean, I not only do want to say to get this book, Ghosting, but I think it's also a brilliant companion piece to one of Dominic's earlier works, Infinite Distraction, which is like one of the sort of top tier sort of cultural studies of why the internet is driving us insane books. And one of the things I really appreciate is it really does. I mean, the ghosting doesn't see as it the book is not necessarily not the term does reject any kind of strict binary between the online and the offline, because I think at least now in our current political moment that distinction has completely collapsed. Anyone who has had their very offline, relatives or co-workers ask them what a groiper is in the past couple of weeks will know that this binary is completely collapsed, because the ruling class are on their phones more than everyone else, or at least they have more time to stare at them because they're not barking orders, they're just sort of delivering them. I mean, there's a reason why it's called a feed, because it's a trough. But I just wanted to ask about sort of how the sociology of ghosting arises out of both sort of hyper commodification of everyone's time, and even indeed the idea of we are more connected to each other than ever before. And you cite in the book, there's a number that there's a rough estimate of 150. We can mostly maintain relationships to a top limit 150 people. How does the hyperconnectivity of our lives, and indeed the precarity of our lives, where every connection pushes us towards that limit, and there's an opportunity cost there because we are trained to see ourselves as human capital, how does this give rise to the phenomenon of ghosting in these multiple contexts that you explore in the book?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, I do see this as a sequel to Infinite Distraction, I suppose. It's more or less a kind of update in a way. And yes, the number you mentioned is the Dunbar number, the sociologist who makes that claim that 150 is the most you can make in a kind of organic community, if we can use that term. You're also right, of course, about the Mobius strip between the virtual and the actual, or the online and the offline world. I remember we used to be able to hide behind the phrase AFK, remember, like away from keyboard, if you wanted to actually do something. And that, of course, makes no sense after the iPhone. So yes, this sort of dovetailing or this entanglement between offline and on really complicates our sense of the excess, or just where we are or where others are. Bodies become even more uncanny than they are, that we have virtual presence, or we have, just because somebody's in the same room with you, they're always checking their phone every few seconds, they're obviously not present, even if you can reach out and touch their shoulder. Conversely, someone on the other side of the world can be paying you intensely focused attention through a chat or a Zoom or something. So what counts as proximity, what counts as intimacy, becomes really weird under these conditions. And so, but then, as you suggest, there's also this pressure, the 24/7. I just taught to Jonathan Crary again yesterday, and the pressure to be constantly networking or turning all relationships into potentially lucrative or transactional experiences is pretty intense. And so I tried to, as an experiment, I tried to turn my Facebook friends into I tried to keep it at 150, just to make it, I mean, it's perverse. It's Zuckerberg sphere, so there's nothing organic about it. Everything I do is being mined and monetized there. But I still had this thought that maybe it would feel more rewarding or somehow nourishing or real if I kept it down to 150. So at least I know everyone there. But that's just a perverse experiment. Most people will have thousands of connections, and the slippage between friends and connections is, of course, another important part of all this. Who counts as a friend as opposed to an acquaintance? These sort of inner circles that Google, I think it didn't, when it tried to launch a social network, it was all about circles within circles. So you would literally, like middle school or something, hierarchize your friends and see who's in the inner sanctum and who's not. So yeah, we could certainly have more contacts, most of us just trying to operate in the modern world, than we can juggle. And then it becomes, like trying to control your refrigerator or something. You have to throw some out in order to put some new ones in, or you make those kind of calculations. There's a kind of social calculus that maybe it's even unconscious that goes on in terms of sifting and sorting who can stay, who should go. Often it's not official, right? You're just unofficially demoted. You just find you're just not being contacted as much as you once were. We've all been on the receiving end of this as much as being the active one. So yeah, there's a lot of elements contributing to not just the emergence, but almost the dominance of ghosting it's almost a skill you have to learn, I suppose. They can call it kinder things like Caspering. Apparently that's like friendly ghosting, or detaching with love is, I think, the Instagram version. I don't know, but we're being asked to cultivate a strange full network of people for all sorts of different reasons. And it's impossible to sustain. This is an experiment where we've never been in this sort of territory where you can remain in friendships or romantic relationships for so long. I mean, in so many modulated ways, I suppose, like to refer back to infinite distraction, like we're not just distracted, we're also hypermodulating everything and constantly toggling things. And I think it is Crary who says when you're using the same platforms to organize friends as you are your bank accounts, then everything becomes very flat, like a game of Tetris.
I want to pick up on where you talked about it being a kind of learned skill, because initially I thought there was a sort of boiling frog thing going on with ghosting, that day by day we're just getting more accustomed to this, and maybe we're even expecting to be ghosted at certain times. It reminds me somewhat too of the way that Gen X and like early millennials may have been very tentative about online shopping or dating apps, but that was something that we later embraced. I remember I was a bank teller in 1996, and there was a woman from Texas that I stood next to on the line, and she had met her husband over a BBS or the internet. And it was like so taboo and the thing that was talked about in the break room. But these days it's completely normal. And just before we hopped on here today, one of the folks that I'm following on Instagram shared a meme that I thought was very apt. It's a picture of Ryan Gosling, and it says, "I was born in the right generation. I love," and then there's a list: AI-generated art, Uber Eats, Bitcoin, and getting ghosted on dating apps. And for myself, I'm a man approaching, if not firmly in middle age. I'm married. Not to say that I haven't been ghosted, but I don't seem as under threat in the same way that a lot of young people are, where this is not only part of their everyday reality, but like Adam was pointing out, when it comes to building up our social capital over time, this is now a new operator in that algorithm. And I was hoping to kind of open our conversation even a bit further. In the book, it seems that you want to say that ghosting has moved beyond dating into a kind of broader cultural script. And now it's part of the default mode of treating people as either ephemeral, disposable, fungible in some ways, whether it ties into friendships, workplaces, or even family ties. What do you think? We don't have to do an exhaustive list, but beyond dating itself, what are some of the notable ways that ghosting has appeared to you in your own research? And what do you think the impacts of those particular kinds of ghosting are having on people?
Sure. I mean, I start with an anecdote about my own family. Yeah. Like my uncle, who just decided he'd had enough. This is back in Australia in the 70s, I guess. And he just changed his name, went to London, disappeared. We still don't know where he is, what he's doing, if he's even with us. And so if anyone violently kind of removes themselves and becomes a structuring absence like that, I think that qualifies as ghosting, even if it's before the sort of definition we're working with. It creates the same sort of feelings of abandonment and just kind of, I guess, even maybe trauma's too strong, I don't know. But, well, not if it's a parent or something, right? So if anyone that you're emotionally involved with just suddenly disappears without explanation, then I think it qualifies as ghosting. It doesn't have to be a romantic situation. So families are maybe the first place where that happens. Early friendships are passionate, and they can be just as important emotionally as your first boyfriend or girlfriend, probably maybe even more so. So platonic ghosting can be pretty devastating, even into adulthood, of course, because a true friend, someone you consider a true friend, you would hope would at least give you a heads up, although that doesn't make it any less painful. That's why I start the book with, don't want to give it the whole thing away. But the Banshees of Inisherin is one of my doorways, because this is long before the internet, obviously. It's the 1920s, I think. And one older guy decides he doesn't want to be friends anymore with another older guy. So it's not only young people there either. But to your point, Craig, about younger folks today, I think there is a kind of preemptive wariness that maybe we didn't have as much of back in the day, because any sort of social interaction, I mean, it's part of the whole Sigmund Bauman liquid society, liquid love thing. In some ways, it's easy come, easy go. It's like a Wong Kar-wai film where you just all drift in and out of each other's lives. I think there's an acceptance of maybe it's a little more just sort of random like that. And there's still a kind of romantic melancholia about missed opportunities or just one-night stands or what have you. I can't speak for it either, because I'm not part of that generation. But just from what my students tell me, I think there's still this, maybe it's good news that we're not at the point where ghosting is just presumed. It maybe makes you feel a little down for a day or two, but then you bounce back. I still think there's a caution, there's a fear of it, because you do want to kind of open up. I mean, we're social creatures. One of my more recent mantras is that the self is a collaboration with the other. You need intimate others in order to make that collaboration meaningful for you. You need some form of consistency over time. And, once bitten, twice shy, I suppose. People can quit intimate relationships as much as they can a job, if they're working in the service industry or something. So there seems to be a blurring of boundaries between any type of interaction, whether it's romantic or professional, vocational, where we just can't trust that someone we start to become fond of or rely upon or affect onto, that they could withdraw at any minute. And that's part of the whole precarity of the zeitgeist. When it's not just economic precarity, but it's emotional precarity. And that in itself, you could draw the dots between that and, speaking of mantras, the whole stuff around self-care. Who can you rely? You can only rely on yourself. I guess we're really screwed if we start ghosting ourselves. I'm sure there's a way to do that. But yeah, that would be my sort of quick from the hip response to the really important kind of angle.
And in terms of the idea of ghosting the self, I mean, Freud makes quite a few appearances in this book, particularly in the idea of the idea of the loss, sort of the ghost of the object of the first attachment from the mother, and then the Fort Dar games, or the hiding game, and as well, it seems like, as you say in the book, that ghosting has a structure of a kind of melancholia, as well as a kind of mourning. It seems to combine both, and maybe there seems to be like an ambiguity around it as well, because there's an ambiguity around, I guess, death. I mean, someone can ghost without being dead, but you give some examples of actually the fact that someone can die can actually mean that they linger on. There is a kind of ghosting, not in the sense that all dying is a form of ghosting, but it's to do with the relation to the person who is feeling that absence. As you said before, it's a structuring absence. Can we talk a little bit about if you want to get into sort of I think go with psychological or metaphysical, or maybe both, I don't know, but the idea of absence here and how that allows you to sort of use the concept of ghosting to talk about these many different appearances of it, but still nonetheless give it a unifying role or function within certain social relationships.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. I mean, Miss Havisham is one of the spirit animals of ghosting, one of the originals, I suppose. And in some ways, it's such a cruel thing to do because, yeah, as you say, there's no closure. And so you kind of erect a shrine to the person who's gone internally. That's what melancholia kind of is. You can keep a hold of the lost object through your yearning for it. So there's always this virtual aspect of the ghoster. Again, going back to Freud, and even more so Lacan, of course, the beloved is always a kind of spectral projection, right? So if there wasn't even no proper sexual relationship in the first place, or a romantic relationship, that's partly because they are at least 50% phantasm, right, from the beginning. So you're mourning not just the flesh and blood, inaccessible other that you've fallen for, but for the sort of cruel optimism in Berland's sense, the kind of the story that you've projected onto the other as someone who will, if not complete you, at least get you a lot of the way out of whatever lack you're feeling. It's quite a common theme that you can get angry at someone who's close, who dies, of course, even beyond their own capacity. If someone happens to have a tragic end, you could still be angry at them. You're totally irrationally, right? We kind of have this unspoken contract with each other that we will abide, we will endure fidelity to the event of our meeting. I think there's a sort of perverse jouissance in the grief that follows. And you can be addicted to being ghosted or the feeling of being ghosted, as Miss Havisham shows, right back at the beginning. It's clearly there's some kind of wallowing that must work on some deep psychological level that I think is part of it. Yeah, so this, back to the Fort Da thing, that nobody is guaranteed to be present and fully available, like emotionally available. We know that about parents and things. They might be there, but they're not there in the way you want. So ghosting can be this very specific type of abandonment that then unspools to, in true psychoanalytic style, to just uncover all the ways that you felt like people weren't there for you, so to speak. What would it mean to be really there for someone 24/7? That's sort of the demand of the irrational demand of the heart, or the libido, or the soul, and nobody can do that. So we're always going to be disappointed to an extent, and we're always going to be paranoid to an extent. But that's all the great literature. There's a dark pleasure in feeling jealous, feeling like you're about to be abandoned. It's part of the whole complex of desire. If your desire thrives on being delayed, or perhaps suddenly jolted out of its hypnosis. So I feel like I'm being pretty vague there, but were you thinking of something else in terms of that?
No. I think it's good to bring the psycholytic dimension into it, because I think you're right. There is a kind of certainty in that loss. And I also think as well, when you bring up in the book sort of the idea of recognition as well, it's like, in order to, I mean, this is why my big critique of the master-servant dialectic, I won't get into just now, but I will just say is that only one side declares that the other thing is the kind of thing that it needs to fulfill its desire. It's very one-sided, and I think the dialect doesn't get past that. And I think it's similarly, when we are searching for connections outside, we are searching for someone according to our desire first and foremost, as you said. And it is ultimately that the recognition we yearn from them is a recognition that we tell ourselves that they can give us. And in their absence, there's still something that lingers there that says, okay, they were, especially if you're expecting to be disappointed, someone who puts, I'm the sort of guy who gets ghosted on dating apps in their like profile or something. And they will say that, yeah, you see, this confirms that your departure confirms that I've recognized myself in this way, and you've actually given me what I wanted. So I think there is definitely a self-sustaining kind of inversion of a recognition dialectic there. And I will stop myself there.
Well, there is something narcissistic about one thing we can't forgive of the one who's ghosted us, is that they took how we felt around them with them, right? So it's that one thing we fall in love with another as how they make us feel a slightly different person, a better person, a more attractive person, whatever. And if they leave, then they take that ideal version of ourselves with them, and we're stuck with the B team, as it were. And so that's a compounded crime of the ghoster. But I would say that yes, new media, especially smartphones and things, they're the perfect conditions to allow for ghosting to happen. But they also encourage, the flip side of that is what I call the zombie relationships, right? Where you can have a stalemate, or things can go on far longer than they would have normally in the analog world, just because it's so easy to stay in each other's orbits or networks, or just quickly check in and see how your ex is doing, or online stalking and stuff. It's more precarious, but in some weird ways, it's also more durable or sticky. The ectoplasm is there in different ways.
Oh, sorry. Just one second. In terms of the zombie model as well, I think it's really good to apply it as well, particularly in the workforce, because the job of most people with email jobs is to circulate money. They've been given a license due to their relative class position to spend money and keep it in circulation. And in exchange, they'll have to do email jobs or flatter whatever venture capitalist ego, put them up to doing a stupid idea as a tech company. And that's why most of these people are doing the same thing all the time, which is they are sending each other ChatGPT emails all the time. And that, I think that definitely is a kind of the quiet quitting as a kind of simultaneous ghosting and zombification, but also make zombies of us, because we're just like, I don't want to use my brain right now. So partially, I think fair. You're withholding your, as Bifo would call it, your neurological energy, but sadly, the machine that you're using also just relies on the neurological energy of thousands of other people. So you're just kind of spreading it rather than actually quitting it. But I think there's definitely, that's what I really appreciate about the zombie category, because the zombies, of course, have, not in the philosophical zombie, which is a pretty problematic category in itself, but this kind of semi-automation, this kind of living death of its own discourse. I found a really interesting category to apply. But sorry, Craig.
Well, we may have moved beyond my comment, but maybe not. Just thinking about, for example, how the online space allows us to sort of project ourselves more broadly and occupy various parts of our mental and psychic cartography simultaneously at any given time. I was actually looking at some more recent research that came out after the publication, or after at least the writing and editing of your book, Dominic. And I found a study that said that participants who were ghosted in this study reported that they sustained an emotional attachment rather than let go of it, and that they were more likely to monitor the person who was ghosting them. And that attends to another study that I looked at that said 2025 study of young adults found correlations between experiences of ghosting, gaslighting, and increased paranoia or depressive symptoms. And so when we think about, for example, how, atomization that comes in capitalist modernity, that is being exacerbated by this social practice. And maybe that leads me to what I think is a big thing that stands out to me in your book, which is ghosting deployed as a kind of psychic violence. And in fact, I do believe that you use the term auto-gaslighting, where a person who is ghosted begins to doubt whether a relationship was ever real. And another interesting mention in the chapter on dating comes from Nicole Dular, who I think is a feminist scholar. And you say that there's an argument to be made where women should be able to use ghosting as a kind of psychological weapon against men in particular, because it creates an offset against systemic patriarchy. And so I was hoping that we could sort of unpack the bigger picture of the weaponization of ghosting.
Right. Yes. The auto gaslighting thing feels more, it's experienced on the level of the psyche, right? So it's more about the big other, the ghoster, is the only person who can confirm it happened. So that's when you start to have weird kind of, metaphysical doubts, because you need the other person to reconfirm that it meant something, that it was meaningful. Otherwise, and so there is a sort of sense that you can be trapped any sense of existential loneliness is amplified tenfold by having this momentary release from that and then being plunged back down into the well. When it comes to the sort of sociological aspect, I'm not sure if that study was about the weaponization of ghosting. That it was more defensive. I think it was more like a shield. From what I recall, it was more like men can be very controlling. They can get very stalkerish pretty quickly, or just not take no for an answer, or not read social cues very well. And sometimes you just need to ghost people so that they get the message. And so there's a heavy gendered element about that when it comes to online dating, because given the manosphere and just patriarchy in general, as you say, men might feel like more entitled to a follow-up date or just more attention than the other person would like to give. So there was that argument, and that was in tandem with the data. And I always take data with a grain of salt, but the statistics seem to suggest women ghost much significantly more than men, even if in popular culture it's the dudes who just sort of get bored and disappear in the TV shows or the rom-coms or whatever. So there's a lot more research that you could do around the gendered aspects of this. But I teach at one of the top queer schools in the country, and definitely from my students, I don't think it's got anything. No one's immune to this kind of thing, wherever you are on the orientation spectrum. Is that? I feel like I missed a good section of your question there, Craig. But when it came to weaponization, were you thinking about how maybe people can in fact wield it as a threat or something like that?
Well, maybe in my defense, weaponization here doesn't necessarily mean offense. It does mean defensive as well, where we can use these tools to mobilize defenses, shields, firewalls against the diminishing of our social capital, for example. So one thing that immediately comes to mind is, remember when Elon Musk took over Twitter? One of the first things that he did was he altered the blocking function.
Oh, that's right.
So that in the past, if you blocked somebody, they couldn't access your account. They couldn't see your feed. Now, granted, you could, this is another part of the sort of imperceptibility or the absencing aspect of digital culture. You could have a burner account where you could view that person, but you couldn't interact with them in the same way. You couldn't as readily screenshot things, share them to a Discord server, or repost them on your own feed. And many argued that endangered stalking victims and other vulnerable users. And once again, those on the far right and in those techno-libertarian circles, they frame that kind of visibility as being essential to free speech. We need to open up this space ever more, but really what that occludes is how that really alters the terrain of how social capital is gathered, protected, and how we mitigate against onslaughts.
Yeah, that would be the more Deleuzean approach, right? The ghosting as a war machine.
It could be, yeah. Well, let's talk about that.
Well, yeah, blocking would be one of the tools, I suppose. I think I mentioned it in the book. One of the most devastating moments in popular media I saw in the last 10 years was, I think it was the Christmas special of Black Mirror, where they figured out a technology where you could block someone even on the street, like in real life, like their face becomes a blur. And yeah, that just really shuddered me to the core. Even if it could be useful in some circumstances, just having that option is pretty chilling because, maybe it's more Levinas than Deleuze. You're wiping away the face of the other and at a vulnerable kind of moment when maybe they're just seeking closure or some explanation. And it just seemed to be an absolute abdication of your ethical obligation to the other. It'd be interesting to know what Levinas would say about blocking or something, right? Because he might go for the free speech angle because if you're protecting the self, or Simone Weil, we need a whole panel of these figures to talk about ghosting. I'm sure ChatGPT could arrange it for us, but it would be very dull compared to the actual seance.
Well, all of this has made me think that we could have a whole typology of ghosters. And essentially, this is kind of what your book does in a way. It stoked my philosophical creativity and made me think, okay, what are some of the things that maybe Dominic didn't focus on? Like, for example, the lurker. So this is an internet archetype that's existed maybe even prior to ghosting being as prevalent as it is, where somebody is watching an account from afar silently, that sort of thing. But also I thought of in the rare instances that either I was ghosted or I felt that I was ghosted in my life, there's also a kind of revenant phenomenon of ghosters. So somebody might disappear for 3 years and then pop up and say, "Hey, how's it going, man? I haven't seen you in a minute." Often it's the case where that relationship left off on something complicated or incomplete or undone. And I've had that sort of thing where then it kicks in that auto gaslighting thing. Like, hey, shouldn't we go through that thing that we left off on 3 years ago?
Right. They're hoping for just a clean reboot. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I certainly, the lurker is a good one. In a way, ghosting is the wrong term because ghosts freak us out by turning up. Like they're almost too present sometimes. So that's why one way in which the term isn't sufficient or doesn't capture the whole thing, because ghosting is actually, you're not haunted. You're haunted by, you'd like to be haunted. And so that's where the auto gaslighting comes in. You play the role of the ghost as well, because they're not even willing to do that. so they're just sort of left the building. We can deal with spirits, actually. There's something comforting about spirits. And one of the issues, I think, with modernity, I've talked about this in other different ways, that it's almost worse to have no access to the dead, to the spirits, to the departed, what have you. So that's the real nightmare, is being sort of left alone in the harsh fluorescent light of the 24/7 world without even the possibility of untimely hauntings.
No, yeah, I think in terms of because I know we talked about ghosting in romantic sphere and the political sphere, and in terms of ghosting in romantic sphere, it makes complete sense that ghosting would be an operative practice, because there's finally this mediating barrier in a situation in which historically, particularly for women, has been incredibly dangerous. Rejecting. Even in this century with someone like Elliot Rodger, rejection can come with a real risk, and there's a factor here of safety in the mediating being, like, you can just leave, and this is why there are good parts and bad parts of the kind of social mediation in which we are all sort of considered individuals, and then at the same time we are allowed to withdraw from certain social situations. It's just I think in terms of, if you want to be like a positive political attempt, it's about how do we withdraw from situations, and who is allowed to withdraw, how are we distributing the withdrawals of our investments. Because I mean, hell, I was ghosted pretty recently by my fucking boss. He just took all the money out of the company, fucking legged it, just didn't tell anyone. And I was like, damn. I'm like, did I get my termination letter? He's like, no. I was like, well, he didn't say no, he just said, just close my Gmail account. I was like, okay, that's a form of ghosting. Like,
yes, we haven't talked about that one as much. The professional ghosting and the social ghosting.
Yeah, there's a professional form of ghosting, and even I think to some extent that idea of sudden withdrawal, it is kind of one of. I mean, I would say that neo-reaction is an ideology whose principle is the free ability to ghost at any time. Right? If people read in texts like the Dark Enlightenment, doesn't fucking talk about ghosts, talks about, dark elves and wizards and Sauron and all that bollocks. I'm not giving Nick any credit, but he will talk about the principle is no voice, free exit, and it's modeled on white flight. White flight are kind of like, we're packing up, we don't want to be part of this community because we want our privilege, we're leaving. And they are but their money sometimes sticks around, they become landlords. And there's this whole economic structure of ghosting, even the way of talking about blocking. I mean, again, I think most people know the whole free speech debate was mostly a load of bollocks, because it's just like, okay, it's speech is free, but you definitely fucking aren't, because if you say the wrong thing, your speech can freely float out there, but you will be yanked off so you can't say it again, or yanked away. I mean, if you want to talk about sort of the John Hamm sort of Black Mirror, blocking people in real life, that's the Gestapo snitch of your average suburb. I mean, it is that. I think that's the kind of economic, and there's definitely a structure of ghosting, and it really comes through in the way that you bookends the book by saying that ghosting in a way is a method of interaction in a state of not societal breakdown, but societal sort of murder in a way. Because you start off in the book, you say, well, you just bring out this idea from Thatcher that society, there's no such thing as society, and then you end it with this amazing quote, which I'm just going to read out, not all of it, because we only give away too much of the books, but you say that ghosting is thus one of the morbid symptoms of the radioactive half-life of a society that has, in fact, died. And in terms of ideas, in terms of speaking for my own society of the United Kingdom, we're kind of out of ideas. We kind of hope to sort of ghost the process of democracy and ghost the process of ideas generation in the hope that essentially a wizard will do it. A bunch of companies named after Lord of the Rings will put a magic machine in place that will do our thinking for us. Like, it seems like this withdrawal, particularly from our own ruling class, is itself a kind of ghosting of their societal obligations. Not to be too betight about it, but wealth used to have an obligation to it, and now you can just hit the bricks. You can just leave.
Yeah, I remember even in the 90s, I think large parts of inner London were just dark because they were owned by rich folks from elsewhere who weren't there. And even COVID accelerated this, of course, in New York is where I know best. And just, I think ghost kitchens are utterly symptomatic of this, these kind of weird spaces that used to be restaurants where you could go to and have some kind of simulation of a local community. But now they're just hubs for these delivery apps and delivery services. And yeah, it's like the sort of phantasms of the neighborhood, right? You just don't, their Ghost World was the comic, I guess, from the 80s, was it 90s, early 90s, late 80s? Ghost Town, the specials I name check. It's maybe, it is a sort of, we could go back, but when was there really this social plenitude that we lament the lack of? But like you said, yeah, maybe certainly the uber wealthy used to funnel at least a certain percentage back into things, your Rockefellers and what have you. But no, the withdrawal, there is almost a rapture going on, a kind of ghosting by the less than 1% or whatever it is now, the 20 people that own all the money, and ghosted the rest of us, and we're all left behind, kind of bruised and isolated and not trusting each other. And as you say, even if you're just trying to pay rent, if you don't know your boss is going to disappear, or if you're a small business owner, you don't know if your employees will show up the next day. And it's a recipe for whatever we call this 2025. I mean, there seems to be, even the young folks, this isn't just an old man get off my lawn thing. Like my students were complaining yesterday about, there's just no sense of social responsibility anymore at street level. Not even please, thank you, the sort of fatic politesse or anything like that. It's sort of like, we're all just ghosts, sort of hungry ghosts, angry, hungry ghosts, just sort of swooping through the streets like some miserable manga. I don't know. It's not good, but I guess the hope is there's always, with any kind of revenant, as you say, maybe we can loop back another time in a different mode and restart. Or this is one of the few books, I guess, I didn't even feel the obligation to have a kind of redemption, perverse redemption possibility, Agamben's weird secret third thing that's going to rescue us or anything. Like I usually do that little gesture, at least to some offstage hope. But here it was like we've been abandoned even by ghosts, because they're so bored by us that they won't even show up for seances even more because we're just so dull.
Well, for Agamben, for its messianic time, it's basically, and he won't admit to this, it's Jesus that will save us.
Right.
But Jesus quite famously gave up the ghost. So, I mean, that's not going to work here.
I have a little quip in my notes. I mean, I thought it was clever, but, we often think of modernity or maybe even post-modernity in terms of the end of history. But ghosting has seemed to create the opposite problem, histories that don't end, leaving relationships unresolved, without closure, without finality. There's a sense, like you said, Dominic, that we have abandoned all sense of social responsibility. And I'm going to sell the book again right here. I'm thinking like a high school teacher. This book is just, it's so digestible and just so interesting, and it's many facts and many insights. And it makes me think that, for example, if I were a high school English teacher doing something like media literacy or doing any sort of cultural literacy, this seems like an urgent problem that we must address. And I would want to create a module using Dominic's book, thinking about how do we think through the ethics of ghosting. And I'm just wondering if while you're doing this, I don't see much in the book that's prescriptive in that way, but what is to be done in the spectral realm?
Yeah, I didn't try to answer that question. I don't feel equipped for it. This is the diagnosis mode. It's very much the first. I'm not trying to be the last word whatsoever, but just to invite this conversation on different levels. But yeah, the idea of a zeitgeist, I suppose, is even speaking of postmodernity and the end of history, like the spirit of the times is since Mark Fisher times. It's like is weird, right? We don't know. It's very snaky, eating its own tail. It doesn't have. It's a very. This is a Grafton Tanner world, isn't it? The time isn't linear, and so ghosts aren't from the past necessarily, or they're from futures that were never allowed to happen, or just circulate in strange retro spirals. Again, my students love talking about Y2K just as a shorthand for whatever aesthetic they're into now. So what is to be done? Well, we know the answer Silicon Valley gives is like, well, friends, you can't rely on human friends. So here's ChatGPT and here's a pendant that you can wear around your neck that sounds like Scarlett Johansson that will respond to you in real time. You can go to the art gallery with her instead. That's their answer. Our answer is more difficult. Yeah. I mean, we sort of lapse into this is where we need some drinks and where we just get into opinions, I suppose, or aspirations. But the how to hang out books and how to do nothing books are part of this, I think, that rediscovering sociality. I mean, I am a big Fourier fan because I think he's a sort of underexplored avenue in terms of like rediscovering what it means to hang out and be together. And well, that was one of Roland Barthes' excellent lecture series that was published posthumously, How to Live Together. And I can't remember if I made this point on the last interview or not, but it's one I'm very fond of. He points out that we tend to think in terms of the subject or society. And so it's either this very small scale or this massive abstract scale. And we don't talk about these sort of small communes, cliques, monasteries, schools, these sort of where actual life happens. Like, yeah, the job, the office or the Discord server or whatever it is, whether it's virtual or not, that's the scale we actually live on, the Dunbar number. And how do we rediscover, or like, how do we annex or protect or reinvent something that feels organic, even if it's not, and even if it never was? Maybe that's the challenge, but then how do you do that under the neoliberal pressures, under the hijacking of our attention spans? I mean, my other recent book is about attention, and I think that's probably an important part of it. Also thinking beyond the human, more than human communities. My other book is about talking to bees. Like, we shouldn't ghost the natural world and other creatures, clearly. So maybe some kind of palimpsest of those things is what my personal answer would be. But that's why we need a podcast like yours and just ongoing conversations, because no one person is going to provide the answer. And if they think they have it, then they're not to be trusted, because this is it takes a village.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm walking away from this book with, my sort of galaxy brain insight, it actually springboards off a conversation that I just had with Federico Campagna on his new book, Other Worlds, where in talking about the politics of nostalgia, he frames revanchist politics as kind of pushing the imaginary onto the real, trying to stretch it over the real in some ways. And with ghosting, I see it as pushing the real into the imaginary, but not in a laudatory way, in a way that ontologically demotes it, in a sense, so that people now hold the same ontological and ethical status as a daydream, a trending piece of news, for example. And so going forward, as a philosopher, I'm thinking this is symptomatic of this perforated boundary between the imaginary and the real, where things are not accorded in the right place. But it has real on-the-ground stakes when it comes to, for example, rendering someone substantial, real, as a friend, like those categories, friend, how it's absolutely troubled by this phenomenon of ghosting.
Yeah, we're so skittish, right? We sort of do have one foot out the door all the time, if in case something gets awkward or even just cringe, and we're like, okay, I'm out. So yeah. Maybe we have to kind of encourage each other more to, Haraway calls it, what is it? Staying with the trouble, but maybe we should dwell with the cringe or something.
And sequel.
Yes, dwell with the cringe. There you go. That's
Dominic's next book.
Well, I'm very well qualified to talk about that as someone who produces inordinate amounts of it. But yeah, so I don't know. It's hard not to sound too. I mean, in some ways, I like Gavin Mueller's project, and others around Luddite is like rethinking the Luddites as maybe some kind of models. The way to go. It's clearly it's something has to happen, given that every news cycle is just getting more and more desperate. So and the solution isn't going to come from. I don't want to be just a passive accelerationist and say, well, we just have to wait it out and then regather amongst the ruins. So, I hope there's a new energy for resisting the urge to. Well, like I said, I don't even want to cast ghosting as just a negative thing, because sometimes it's important, but or at least morally neutral. But yeah, like being more. That's why like the film Showing Up, I think, is a lovely counterweight to the Banshees of Inisherin. Just this gentle Kelly Reichardt film about actually quite a heroic thing today, which is showing up for somebody's like art exhibit opening or something. That actually feels like a triumph if people in any significant number show up for, say, my book party or something. That's not nothing anymore. Like, given the bandwidth, given the time famine, given just how. So if we can keep just showing up in those kind of ways, the hope is that you can keep I don't know. I don't want to end on some hopeful note. I don't feel.
It feels like we should, but
it's part of the genre, right? Of like, of winding things down. You don't want to. Yeah, this is why we write. I mean, if I was just pessimistic about it, I suppose I wouldn't even bother writing it, because I'm hoping by diagnosing these things and talking about these things, we can mitigate them. But then there's the sad planet side, which is just...
Yeah, I was about to say, like, last time it tells the whole cosmology is kind of structured like a sadness.
Yeah.
I really do. One of the things you actually just said, which I really appreciated, was, I mean, is this going to sound not very philosophical, but listeners, but hanging out, I do think, is a lost art. Because the reason why I think this, and I'm going to give some very philosophical reasons for why I think this, is because the age of mass information was supposed to be, as Marshall McLuhan called it, a global village. Right, in which we would all be sort of unified in one community. Now, this is an idea which he first came up with. I think he thinks he first came up with it, but the first person to come up with it is Fichte, right? So Fichte's The Vocation of Man, listeners, talks about the thing he says things to be to make a universal system of communication that brings all culture to everybody. And then he also later on in a different text says, and in a state, we would have everyone policing everyone else. And that was what the idea that everyone would be so close to each other, they would be policing each other. That's what McLuhan was worried about with the idea of the global village. Because when he hears about villages, he thinks of nosy people who know everyone else's business, but they're still in a kind of community. Whereas actually what your work on ghosting shows is that if to some extent Marshall McLuhan's a little bit too optimistic because we don't actually have the community aspect. We just have we can see into everyone's business, and we're constantly sort of, in a way, making social bets on each other's output as content through the platforms. Because when I block someone, I'm not saying you should die. I'm saying I don't want to be a receiver. I don't want to be a subscriber, but an investor in your social capital in the social sphere. But when you mention hanging out, I mean, hanging out, I think, is actually a really good way to frame sort of an antithesis to that, because I mean, you can't hang out in a hyper precarious society. I mean, my entire adult life, I've basically always had about 4 or 5 like part-time jobs. That's kind of how I always had to sustain myself. Whereas before, when I was a teenager, you'd have like a friend, you just go to your friend's house, you'd have some drinks, you play the new record, you'd smoke some. You wouldn't smoke some of that, but just for the UK listeners, you would drink some pot. Yeah, but we've lost the art of hanging out because everything has to be like, can you schedule this in? I don't have to schedule.
Yeah, we're demopoling friends, for God's sake. It's obscene. I know, and the Beastie Boys fought for our right to party. So
and possibly died.
Yeah, it was a big. Yeah, there's a Lefebvre quote somewhere that in the Critique of Everyday Life that really makes me go clammy about, written in the 80s, about how our isolation is only going to be even more enhanced by being bombarded by messages every day. And that was like before the internet. So yeah, there is still, we are mammals, we're creatures. There's something about hanging out in each other's funk and pheromones and playing music or doing like non-profitable performative things that is nourishing. Let's just admit it. And the whole world seems to be set up to make sure we can't really do that very much. It's the 24/7 problem. So there's something radical even about just showing up, hanging out, those kind of things. I guess Burning Man was once a statement about that, but now they come in on private jets and stuff. So that's completely gone. But I think the UK, actually, my impression of the UK is because of like the whole folk horror romance and the rediscovery of like, it could go a dangerously nationalistic way, but there does seem to be lots of little pockets of festivals and organic communities. That's maybe I'm just being romantic about missing the UK.
No, because Dominic, if we want to make good on this conversation about hanging out, in November in Brooklyn, November 8th and 9th, we're doing the Durations Festival.
Oh, right.
And
right.
I think maybe you were busy because I can't remember. I put a line out to you to see if you wanted to be part of that. But if you're available, come hang with us, Jason Babak Mohageg, Reza Nagaristani, the Acid Horizon crew, and our fans and our audience.
That's the perfect plug, indeed.
Yeah.
When he says crew, I'm not fucking going through your airport. Sorry, I mean, let's not oversell it. I'm not risking it. Sorry, guys.
We'll beam at him in. Yeah, I'll bring the laptop and just face it towards the audience.
Yeah,
but no, I mean, if you have time, we would love to see you there. And I'm actually going to this will come out at the time when there are probably still tickets to the event. So if you're listening on YouTube or on any of the podcast platforms, just jump down into the show notes, click on it. I'm going to comp you, Dominic. you two free drink tickets. Yeah, you're in.
Okay.
So.
I have to show up. That sounds great. Thanks, great.
Yeah. Well, I'll say in the meantime, well, first of all, everyone should pick up Ghosting on Disappearance out on Polity now. You can get it everywhere, it looks like.
There's a discount code, until Christmas, GHO 20. So it's $13 in the US, and it's pretty cheap in the UK too. So
great.
The ghosting of Christmas past, the ghosting of Christmas present, the ghosting of Christmas yet to come. We'll put it in the description.
Yeah, we gotta do the commodity thing.
Yeah, and before we ghost you today, what is it that you're working on now or next?
It's funny, we mentioned Agamben. I've never managed to ghost him despite all his problems, I guess. I just can't quit you, Giorgio. I mean, I recognize he's very dubious, but I did recently just had a Substack bubble thought about that weird moment in Coming Community. I don't know if you remember it, where in Dim Stockings, where he talks about these women dancing in there. It's an ad for pantyhose from like 1970 or something. So he's just this like horny Italian intellectual in the cinema getting off on these like legs that are for him an example of whatever being and the promise of generic humanity. And I just thought it's such a bizarre moment. I need to bring in other people to help me think this through. And so I'm assembling a pretty cool cohort of folks who are going to just write about that little section. It's like 4 pages or something. And then unpack it towards whatever they're interested in when it comes to like, spectacle, gender, post-identity, those kind of topics. So it's actually I've never done an edited thing before. And that's what I'm involved in at the moment.
Excellent. Well, once you have completed that, and if that's something that you'd like to share with us, please hit us up again.
For sure. I'd love to.